Yeah, and the thing with Kickstarter, I think like 75 to 80% of what you raise generally comes in that first day. So it all comes to a head in just basically 24 hours. And then also it's like a lot of what you earn is based on that first hour or two. So then it's condensed down to like 1 or 2 hours where we're just kind of like watching, seeing that ticker hopefully go up and up and up. But if it doesn't, it's kind of like, you know, the launch wasn't great the first few hours, so maybe the first 24 hours aren't going to be great, so maybe this whole thing is going to fail. So I think that's just kind of there's bound to be some anxiety around that date.
Welcome back to part two of our worldie unboxed episode featuring Adam King, the founder of 1587 Sneakers. In part one, we explored Adam's inspiring journey as an entrepreneur, his decision to use footwear to celebrate Asian American culture, and his strategic approach to competition in the sneaker industry. In this episode, Aaron and I will dive into the key takeaways from our conversation with Adam. We'll break down how his bold approach to building a brand rooted in culture and identity resonates with our own mission at Worldie. As always, stay connected with us at worldiebrand.com and subscribe to the Worldie YouTube channel for more behind the scenes content and highlights from our conversations. Thanks for tuning in. All right, let's jump into part two.
We've been talking about this recently, and it kind of reminded me of this when I was listening to the Adam episode back. But do you think that we should make a bigger deal of the fact that we're minority owned, black owned, veteran owned, kind of like however you want to slice it, any of those different identities?
And I guess for further context, like, what do you mean by bigger deal?
So people, when they see us, they know, like people who know us, they know that we're minorities, they know that we're black.
yeah,
But if you just go to our website, if you don't hit the about page, you don't necessarily know that we're a black owned business. And I know a lot of people try to make that very clear from the outset because, as your company grows, you become less and less founder focused and people might lose sight of who the founder actually is. So do you think as we launch, as we grow, we should kind of make that a big selling point or a big part of our story, or do you think it should just be more organic? And as we put ourselves out there, people kind of they just look at us and they know that we're a minority.
I mean, I understand why it made sense for 1587 and Adam because I mean that's what their brand is about, like an Asian American brand, a brand that really highlights their culture, highlights like things that maybe get overlooked when you talk about like creating a product or marketing. So a lot of that kind of gets overlooked or washed in a light that's not necessarily favorable. But for us, like I don't know if that's like inherent to our brand. So I don't know if I would be pushing it as much as it's going to organically come out because I feel like as we've mentioned in many other conversations, we are a founder-led brand at this moment, simply because one, we don't have the product, and then two, we don't have like the credibility in the space. So it's going to take some getting out in front of like our brand and like really kind of like communicating certain like aspects and features. So I think by way of doing that, we end up highlighting that anyway. Like it just kind of happens. Um, so I don't know if there's any kind of extra emphasis other than potentially like putting it somewhere in the copy, but yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that we can do beyond just like being present and being like the focal point of the brand, and then people kind of like understand, or anyone who can I mean you can see you can understand like okay, these these are two black guys running this company, so it's not going to be like anything that we're hiding, but I feel like it's just going to come out anyway based upon like us being a founder-led brand at the moment.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. Like I always say that, if we are putting ourselves out there, as soon as you see us, you kind of know that we're minorities and you probably know that we're black. So you don't necessarily need to hit people over the head with it because if they see us, then it becomes pretty clear. But kind of a similar question, do you think that because our company is kind of focused on youth sports and and kids. Do you think that in terms of our designs, we should be doing anything that's kind of like a nod to youth sports, kids, anything like that? Because I know we're kind of saying we want it to be kid friendly, we want it to be a really cool design, but should we do anything that's like specifically alluding to certain things within youth sports culture that is, very, very prominent or whatever?
Now, I know we talked about incorporating maybe like nostalgic like nods to millennial youth culture, sport culture. And one of those things was like, oh, the sweet spot on the shoe, like figuring out a way to modernize it and add it as part of the design. And so I guess there are ways to do that. We even talked to like the marketing agency that was kind of helping us with the design early on about like putting any like little hidden features in the shoe that kind of um, make the shoe a little bit more, I don't know, I don't want to say like kid friendly, but like it makes it, it like piques the curiosity. It like makes it feel like, there's like some kind of like secret that you have to kind of discover. Now, that's not necessarily a nod to to kid sports as much as it is like a nod to kids and like their natural like inclination to curiosity. But I am not opposed to it. I think we should do it in a very like on brand way, um, and not try to like force it. But yeah, I'm definitely for that.
Yeah. And I was kind of thinking about it like when you think of youth sports, like what do you kind of think of? And I was like, you think of orange slices, but like would hidden orange
Yeah,
slices on the shoe, would people just be more confused than anything else
right, right.
if they saw that? So I think it's kind of difficult, but I think, like you said, being kid friendly, having those discovery details in the shoe, on the shoe, like on the bottom of the shoe, I think that'll all be really cool. And then we've also talked about basically getting kids to help us design a specific colorway. So, we make our own colorways and then we get input from a bunch of different kids, have them sketch things up, and then incorporate that into a design that we could say is actually designed by kids for kids. So I think that would, if we can actually get enough submissions for that to actually do that, I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, no, I think that's a big deal. A lot of people love to see like we talked early on to one of the guys who was kind of advising us a little bit, and he was saying that designers like to just see their work out there on display. And I think the same thing goes for kids. Like they're young designers in a way, and they would love to just kind of like see their work and then even see the work of other kids being put out on display. It kind of inspires them. It makes it feel more like a kid brand or a brand that really cares about the kid athlete and kind of like incorporates their ideas and incorporates a lot of the things that they like to do into the design, into like just how we position the brand itself. So yeah, I think that's really cool. And kind of on the same vein, I know you asked a question of Adam in terms of like, what do you want people to think about, or what do you want like customers to think about when they hear or they come across 1587? So that same question kind of pitched to us, like, what do you want people to think about, or customers or backers to think about when they hear worldie or when they kind of discover worldie?
I want them to think about youth sports and kind of activity as well. So active kids, I want them to think about that. I want them to think about fun. I want them to think about value and basically I want them to think that this is the best product on the market for basically for our target segment. I want them to think it's the best product in the market. So premium, value, kids focused, and sports focused. I would say those are the four or so that I'd want them to think about.
Yeah, I think that's right on point with what I kind of want them to think about when they come across worldie. And I know you seen those like cheesy commercials? I'm sure you have, where it's a product that like is meant to entice kids to just like, oh, think of it as being like something just desirable. Most of it's like food products and like, oh, this is so great tasting and like it's really, like a treat or something like that. But then on the back end, they're like, oh, but it's healthy for kids, but don't tell kids that, that kind of marketing. Not to say that's the type of marketing that I want for worldie, but I think of it as like a two-prong kind of deal. We've always talked about this being like a two-prong situation. And I think the focus for kids, like when they see the brand, it should be fun. It should be something that makes them feel enthusiastic about like being active, being in sports, and just like enjoying just kind of being outside or being involved in different and various activities. Whereas for the parents, we kind of want them to have that same type of feeling, but we also want them to kind of like get that whole, oh, it's also good for you type of feeling as well. Like it's also good for your kids type of like feeling, like sense that yeah, this brand is doing things responsibly. This brand is making a product that's like going to cut down on the amount of like shoes that you need to purchase. So I think there's a couple of elements that I hope parents get, or whoever's like the guardian who's purchasing the product, that I don't really expect or anticipate kids to get. I expect that to be kind of like transparent to kids, but something that's relatively obvious to parents or guardians.
Yeah, like kids don't really care about value because they're
Yeah.
not the ones paying for the shoes. They don't really care that much about durability. It's like those are things that parents care about. And kids are not really also going to think about their like are my feet going to be able to develop healthily if I wear these
Yeah.
shoes? That's not kids don't think like that. So yeah, I think you're right for sure that basically like kids focused, it means two different things. For kids, it's like this is built for kids. This is fun. This is something that is going to make you want to get up and move, be active. And then for the parents, it's more like we designed this specifically for kids to kind of like set them up for success and not harm their feet or the environment to the extent that we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of think back to that conversation that we had with Tellable. Since it's a good thing, I'll highlight the company. But they were kind of discussing how the product would be a teaching point, or a point that parents can use to like teach kids, and like they can learn about being like, they were saying, being friendly or environmentally friendly. And at the time, we are like, I don't know, I think we were a bit skeptical of it being like a teaching product. But the more that I've like interacted with parents, interacted with kids, been out in various little like trade shows or like pop-up events, the more I realized like, okay, yeah, parents are, maybe I wasn't using shoes for a teaching point, but parents do use different things. Like my teaching, my parenting isn't the end all be all. So there are other styles, and I've kind of witnessed it, that like parents will use that. Like, oh yeah, they're doing this so like it cut down on the amount of shoes, and like kind of like teaching the kids just based off of like talking points that I provided, and not necessarily the product itself. But as like we develop the product, I can kind of anticipate that same type of lesson being passed along to the kid. Like, oh yeah, this is like the reason why these treads look like this is so that it can be used on a bunch of different surfaces, so that you don't have to go out and buy different specialized shoes. And obviously, it wouldn't be said exactly like that, but like that same kind of lesson, the same um, I guess values are kind of being passed down through these types of conversations based upon like the product. And so like perhaps Tellable was onto something when they were originally creating copy that was, a little bit like I guess it made us a little bit skeptical, but now it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not a parent, so I'll defer to you on that one. But I mean, I would love for that to be the case.
Yeah. I'm not saying that happens like it's going to happen all the time, but I think it's going to happen a bit more than we anticipated and that we first thought. So,
Yeah, that makes sense. And then one of the other things that Adam was kind of saying was that just in terms of like the construction of his shoe, the materials, it's pretty similar to products that are already out there.
mhm.
And if he didn't have his story, then it would be almost the exact same as some like I think Koyo, for example, he's talking about.
Yeah.
So I guess first, what do you think about that in terms of us? Do you think without our story, are we just almost like a copycat brand? And then also, how can we be more authentic than bigger brands? Like what parts of our story should we be highlighting to get that across?
I mean, I think since our focus at the onset and the environment that we were creating the brand in or the product in required differentiation, I think we were already trying to distinguish ourselves from brands that were already out there. So we were trying to figure out ways to create a product that would be novel and not something that if you were to remove the logo, it would look or feel like something else. Um, the reason why it's recognizable is because we didn't want to like start off with something that's so different that parents and kids wouldn't be able to navigate to it because it would feel just completely foreign. So I think we don't have that trouble of like looking like another brand because I think we've done a good job of emphasizing that we wanted it to be a distinguished product. Now, does that mean that there's not going to be something out there that you can kind of compare it to and say like, oh, it's similar? I mean, it's shoe, it's footwear, so there's going to be some similarities to it. Um, and again, we didn't want it to be so crazy unique that it didn't look like, something that a kid could be able to put on by themselves or a parent wouldn't recognize it as a product that could be used for like sports or athletics. So in that sense, we kept it within a relatively, um, I guess, similar mold. But I think we definitely came up with a differentiated product. As far as being authentic, I think the best way to be authentic is not addressing everyone, like not trying to have everyone be our target audience, but really trying to speak to our target audience and really focusing on making it like a conversation between us and a parent or guardian or kid. Like it's a much more like one-on-one type of a situation as opposed to like trying to speak to the masses. And I think that's like very big when our voice is very focused um in terms of making it feel and be more authentic because you're really having like a conversation with an individual because you're talking to that target customer, that target backer or whatnot. So I think those are the things that we can do. And it's just in the messaging, it's in the framing of the features, the framing of our value propositions, how we empathize in our copy, realizing the pain points that we're wanting to address and the pain points of our target audience and elaborating on those things in such a way that it's easy for those consumers to really understand and pick up on. So kind of flipping and turning around the question on you. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a good point on the authenticity side. So I think if you really focus on the pain points, you really listen to your customers and you're honest about kind of the process and where you're at, I think people will give you a lot more grace versus if you try to oversell yourself and make it seem like you're selling something that you're not, then people get upset because they think you're just lying to them. But if you say like, hey, we're just two guys trying to create a footwear startup that is that creates shoes that's better for kids because we've heard all these pain points and it's not going to be perfect. The first iteration is not going to be perfect, but if we make multiple iterations, if you help us understand what's working, what's not working, then kind of together we can create a product that's a lot better. So I think if we do that, I think that's something that you can't really do as a huge brand because kind of to your point, then when you're really big, you're kind of trying to be everything to everyone. Whereas we
Yeah.
have a small enough target segment where it feels like almost all the any kind of major pain points that are surfacing feels like we can at least try to address them and they're not really kind of moving in opposite directions. So I think that's kind of the way that you be authentic, or that's the way that we can be authentic. And in terms of differentiation, if it ever got to a point where I felt like we could not get to a differentiated product, even with iteration, and that the story was the only thing that was going to be our differentiator, then I think that's the point where I'd kind of be like, I don't know if I want to keep going down this path with this venture just because, well, what's really the fun in selling the exact same shoe as a Nike or an Adidas with just a different brand and a different story. And I know for some people that would be interesting, but for me, I want to do something that's better. I don't want to do something that's the same with just a different story.
Yeah, no, I can definitely agree to that. Um, Kind of switching gears a little bit and talking about like the launch that I guess we can kind of update the community on that has been slipping, and I think we're gonna more than likely slip to winter, like early next year, simply because don't want to rush it, don't want to try to squeeze things in, especially with the product still. We want to make some changes to it, but uh, based upon like our discussions and uh, our experiences, and then maybe the experiences and the discussions with others. What's your biggest fear or concern with this initial launch?
I would say that, so I mean, before it would probably be just like this is the first point in time where we have to put down like a ton of money all at once. And if nothing sells, then we're just kind of out of that money. So I think logically that's kind of the biggest thing to be concerned about. But I'm pretty excited because it's also the point where we figure out if there's actually demand for our product or not. Because it's been basically 3 years that we've been talking about or kind of like bouncing ideas around. And I'm just kind of excited to get this thing in the market and see if it flops, it flops. If it takes off, it takes off. But I just want to see. I want to get that market reaction. So I'm really excited about that. But then kind of for me, it's more about after the launch. It's like launching and then operations after that. I've just heard that the footwear business, it's really hard to make money. The margins are kind of bad. There's a lot of fixed costs, things like that. So it's just hard to make the cash flow make sense if you don't have a ton of money that you've raised. So I would say that's kind of the biggest concern that I have. It's kind of like we have to get everything operationally, we have to get it almost perfect in order to not lose money. So I think that's kind of my biggest concern.
Yeah, and I just end up echoing that by saying the biggest concern is that the risk that we end up taking, like falling flat. I know Adam kind of mentioned it in terms of like failing publicly. Like it's just that everything's going to be coming to a head. It's like that moment of like, are we going to be successful with this initial launch or not? And that's like the thing that it's just the unknown, not really having a clear understanding. And I've heard that echoed in a lot of founders, like their story, especially like those who've gone through like a Kickstarter or a similar crowdfunding kind of campaign. Like they talk about that day when you turn on the campaign, like it's green light, and you just don't know. Like you hope, you've done a lot of like pre-launch stuff, you put in a lot of effort, and now it's like where rubber meets the road. Is it really going to have any kind of traction with the community that we've been so focused on for the last couple of years, or is it going to just flop and you're back to either the drawing board or you're scrapping it? So I think that to me is like the biggest concern, or the maybe like the biggest fear. And that's probably like a bad word for it. It's just like that, it's a bunch of like anticipation that's going to be all kind of like coming to a head at a moment when we decide to like go ahead and hit the green light or whatnot. So
Yeah, and the thing with Kickstarter, it's I think like 75 to 80% of what you raise generally comes in that first day. So it
yep.
all comes to a head in just basically 24 hours. And then also it's
Yeah.
like a lot of what you earn is based on that first hour or two. So then it's
Yep.
condensed down to like 1 or 2 hours where we're just kind of like watching, seeing that ticker hopefully go up and up and up. But if it doesn't, it's kind of like, you know, the launch wasn't great the first few hours, so maybe the first 24 hours aren't going to be great. So maybe this whole thing is going to fail. So I think
Yeah.
that that's just kind of there's bound to be some anxiety around that date.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean it's crazy to think that all of it comes down to a matter of maybe hours.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it'll be interesting nonetheless. Hopefully we'll be able to speak kindly of it in the future.
Yeah.
Um, this isn't on the same vein. It's just another question that kind of came up as I was thinking about our conversation or listening back to the conversation with Adam, and how he was talking about like, oh yeah, you really want to have people who have different skills than you on the team, like who have like a different background than you. That kind of, and this isn't something new. We've heard this before. They can kind of cover those blind spots that you may have or those gaps in your experience or knowledge that you may lack. So as we think about the next teammate, and we've thought about it for a while, and we've also like kind of gotten close to like bringing in a new teammate. What do you think makes the most sense in terms of like their skill set? Like what should this teammate be in charge of? Like we don't necessarily have to worry about titles or anything, but like what kind of skill set should they be bringing to worldie that would best help us in present and in the near future?
I would say either marketing or operations, because both of those are extremely important, and both of those, like, we can try to do it ourselves, but we're not necessarily going to be as effective as someone who is an expert in it. So I
Yeah,
think one of those two would be good.
that's exactly what I kind of landed on, either ops or marketing. Um, I would right now, I'm leaning towards marketing simply because it's got so much influence on how we perform out the gate. Like marketing will be a big component and a big determinant in terms of like, okay, are we going to be successful because we've got a lot of like traction with backers, or we not going to be successful because no one knows about us? So I think marketing to me is it's at the top simply because it's the closest alligator. So that could potentially change shortly after the launch if we have a successful launch, and then now we're trying to work on the fulfillment end, and we're like, oh crap, I really wish we had somebody with ops like really kind of like get us through these the logistics of it all. So yeah, I think marketing for me right now, but ops could very very soon change and become one of the more prominent things that we kind of like look for in terms of bringing on a new teammate.
Yeah. Which that's kind of a segue to one of the questions I had. So a lot of the people that we've come across in the footwear space, they're kind of like footwear lifers. So they've been in the space for 25, 30, maybe even 40 years, whatever. And Adam, I think he said he's been in the space for 20 years. And
Yeah.
whenever he said that, I was surprised because he looks youthful. It's like, you don't
Yeah, he
look like
does
you're
look
old
pretty
enough
young.
to work 20 years in the footwear space. But did you ever kind of think about either working at a footwear company full time or interning at one just to build up that skill set a little bit before going off and building your own footwear company, or did it not feel feasible because of the whole like conflict of interest thing?
No, I don't think I ever thought about like going to work at a footwear brand simply because this idea happened a little bit closer to like execution. So it wasn't something that like, okay, we were necessarily, or at least I wasn't necessarily like focused on. I was hoping to jump into entrepreneurship, wanting to launch a venture, but didn't know the space. And when this came along, I think I didn't like even consider like going to quote unquote school to learn more about footwear before jumping into it. I think like our own version of like the School of Hard Knocks and kind of like bumping around has been a great education like for us. Just talking to people in the industry, um, picking experts' brains to figure out like, okay, what do we need to do next? Like what can get us to from A to B and B to C and so on and so forth. So I think like that's really been my approach. Like this is like something that we have to learn on the go. And potentially that's kind of something that like I've I've kind of picked up even more, even in the practice of law, like knowing that like there's going to be situations, circumstances, cases, um, deals that I don't have a complete understanding on. So you have to go out and get smart on it. And that's kind of the same mindset that I took with footwear. Like I'm going to have to go out and get smart, but I'm going to learn as I grow, as opposed to taking time off and kind of putting myself through quote unquote school to learn it prior to actually jumping into it and immersing myself into it. So no, I never really, no, I at all considered working at another footwear company, startup, etc., prior to like just like diving headfirst into this. What about you?
So I had thought about it a little bit. I thought about it in between our second and third year of grad school. And there's this one company that I've really liked. I don't wear their shoes, but I like kind of their mission, and I think it's a super differentiated product. And I was emailing them kind of like over and over again. I was like trying to find anyone I could on LinkedIn to reach out to. I reached out to them like 10 different times in 5 different ways, and they just never got back to me. So it wasn't really a possibility, or wasn't an opportunity. But it was one of those things where I was like, I know that I want to do something entrepreneurial over the summer. And then from there, I'll figure out what I want to do after grad school. But I just wanted to take the summer to get experience working in a startup. And I thought, startup and in footwear, then that's almost like the perfect summer experience to get. But yeah, they didn't give me an opportunity to even interview. So I did a different type of startup that summer.
Yeah, I think I vaguely remember you kind of talking about that. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, th if that were to like, if that had materialized, then like that would have been kind of like perfect. But I kind of consider that like, yeah, that's just another like, you know, chance to like pick expert's brain. It's not like we were like being a part of that industry, not like Adam was. Like Adam was looking to work in the industry for a while, and he worked there for a decade or more prior, like jumping into his own venture. So he really like really went in. Whereas I think for us, it's more kind of like getting enough information to where we're kind of dangerous and then jumping in there and really like picking things up on the go. And yeah, I think that's how I've always kind of viewed it. So yeah.
Yeah. So similar question to that, or it's kind of like a segue. So do you feel like you've had to unlearn certain things that you've learned in your previous professional life to be successful in startups? And then also, do you feel like you have to turn certain things off or on as you go from your day job to worldie and back?
I guess one major difference between working in a startup and my previous profession, which is even before law, was being in the military, being an aviator, and then also being, in space operations. The military, all of its operations, uh, they strictly adhere to a checklist. So you have a checklist and you follow the checklist. And if you deviate from the checklist, that's when you kind of like get in trouble. That's when, evaluators or the powers that be come in and they really dissect like what you were doing, what you were like, why were you deviating from this established procedures that we've like provided you? And if it wasn't a good enough reason, then that's when you start, really getting hammered. So that doesn't fly in the startup community. Like there's no checklist to like setting up a startup or setting up like a footwear company or, launching your own venture. There's no like, book. There's different like points of view and opinions, and people might have like committed that to like paper or provided it in some kind of blog or some book or whatever so that you can kind of read things, but it's not like a step-by-step procedure for you to follow in order to be successful or in order for you to like quote unquote complete the mission. And so that's a mindset that has to, that had to change. There's no, established procedure that I need to like recall in order to like get from point A to point B. It takes a lot of like trial and error. You're like really venturing off into the unknown and you're really kind of doing things by the seat of your pants, and that kind of stuff kind of gets frowned upon when forming operations in the military. You don't want to shoot from the hip. Whereas we shoot from the hip on a day-to-day basis, like maybe a minute-to-minute basis, simply because it's required. And there's no one telling you like this is the roadmap step by step that you need to be following. So for me, that's like one of the mindsets that I've had to turn off and say like that's not useful here. What about you?
Yeah, so my previous professional life and my current professional life are the same. I'm just more higher up the ladder now.
Right.
But there's a lot of differences for sure between a very corporate job and a startup. And I think for me, like my job is pretty hierarchical. So if someone tells me that I have to do something, I have to do it. And basically, most times people tell me exactly how to do it. And now having the experience of doing my own thing and kind of setting my own schedule, doing what I want to do, doing it the way that I want to do it, like it's a bit harder for me to now kind of work in that hierarchical environment. And because I'm kind of like I've had the experience now of just running my own thing, like I kind of like that. But if you have a supervisor or boss, whatever you want to say, you can't be a maverick in the corporate world the same way that you can with your startup. So I think that's one of the things it's more like a mindset thing that's been a little bit hard. And then also like with my job, um, there's a lot of process. So writing up plans, reviewing them, iterating a lot, trying to get things kind of like as perfect as possible. Whereas I think with a startup, a lot of times it's you get that like 50% version and then you throw it out there and you get some feedback and then you iterate and that doesn't really work with client services, like throwing out a 50% version, seeing what they think and iterating based on that. Like you'll lose a lot of the client's confidence and maybe you'll lose their work. Like they'll fire you or whatever if you do that. So that's also
Yeah.
something that's a bit different.
No, I agree. And that's very similar to my current day job. And then also it's just the whole um, risk assessment kind of situation. Like my current like day job being an attorney, like it's all about like risk. Mostly it's about risk aversion, like figuring out ways to mitigate or to reduce or to step away from risk. And risk in startups are like that's the I don't know, that's the nature of of the job, the nature of the venture. It's like it's all about risk and your appetite for it. So I think there's some like those things are kind of like at odds as well. So maybe turning that component off a little bit is also beneficial in order to like help us to maybe take some chances that we wouldn't necessarily take if we were just strictly wearing a lawyer hat or something like that. So
Yeah.
my last question that I have actually probably should have been asked a bit earlier because it was in the context of like this the story and everything like that when we were kind of mentioning Adam's approach to 1587. But how do we tell our story or tell a story through our product?
I think it's communicating the intentionality behind the product. So we have we could have released a product like maybe more than a year ago at this point. There's been multiple times where we could have released a product, but we didn't because it didn't align with our vision and we didn't feel like it was differentiated enough or we didn't feel like it was solving these different pain points. So it's been a really long process, and people on the outside don't necessarily know that that process has been so long because we're basically saying like we're not going to put something out that's not kind of delivering what our target segment needs. And we've made a lot of really intentional, painstaking, sometimes expensive decisions to make sure that we come out with a product that is differentiated. So I think it's just kind of communicating those decisions, right? So we got a designer who, was able to create a differentiated tread pattern that works across all these different surfaces. So maybe you highlight kind of his backstory, what he's done in the past, and then why he made these choices and exactly how it works. We've talked about durability. So maybe you talk specifically about the materials, why they're durable, kind of like what we could have done instead, and how much more durable the materials that we are using versus, like the average material, for example. So I think it's basically like each decision that we've made that benefits the target customer. We just have to make it clear to them why we've made that choice, how it benefits them, and just kind of like use that to reinforce our story and that we care about the pain point, solving these pain points for our target customer.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think to kind of like take it to that next step, I feel like even when they pick up the product and say they didn't get all that context that we have out there in the copy and the marketing and the branding and our messaging that we do on our socials and things like that, and they were just to pick it up without any kind of like prior experience, if they were to look at the product, they could start picking out, I guess, value props or significant portions of our story and kind of piecing it together. And some of it's being like very overt about it. And that's something that was like mentioned to us before. Like it's like putting script right in sections of the shoe that say, that make certain statements as to like what this zone is meant to do of the shoe. Like, oh, this is like a spot where you should be kicking the ball. So it's like a target or whatever. Or you look in the inside of the sole and it's like an indication to kids, like this is the left shoe, this is the right shoe. So this is made for kids. This is like made with, the mindset that kids will be wearing this and like it's kid-centric product. The material choices we've talked about, like recycled material or using natural rubbers or things like that, and even making that super or overly apparent from like speckled designs or or even like putting some of that information like right there on the product so that people can start like picking that up and understanding like, oh, they may not have gotten the entire story of worldie. They may not have gone through the site, read like all the pages, listened to the podcast, watched a few of the shorts, but they can like pick up components of the things that we've been talking about for the past couple of years simply by like looking at the products and seeing like the materials, seeing like how we've like we've put emphasis on certain things when it comes to the design and really getting like some of the finer points of like our message in, less than a minute just by like interacting with the product. So building on like what you said, but I think like even like further like pushing that into like the product and incorporating that and even messaging it like super blatant, like an off-white.
Yep. Yep. No, I agree with that. And this is also maybe a question that I should have asked earlier on in the process, but it's kind of funny because when I talked to Adam, he was talking about, I think he said you should do an initial run of 100 to 150.
Mhm.
And I was just thinking like that's impossible for two guys like us because we don't have connections like that.
Yeah.
We've heard like 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. And then basically since then, we've heard that it's possible to do maybe like 200 to 300
Yep.
in an initial run before doing the full 3,000. So like how big of a deal do you think that is that we're able to do that initial smaller run now versus having to commit to like 10x of what we have to commit to now?
I mean, I think it's a huge deal. Like it's a game changer, especially if we find things that need to be tweaked, or we find like things that we didn't recognize as a problem, but then like when consumers start wearing it for longer periods of time, they realize that this is like something that needs to be tweaked. And if we have two, three, 4,000 of those products out there, or like we're sitting on that type of inventory, it becomes a much more difficult process than like, oh, there's only 100 or 200 of those things out there. Like we can quickly like iterate and make those changes as opposed to like, oh man, we really can't make those changes until we sell like another 2,500 pair of these shoes that we know aren't to our standards. And so like I think that's huge for us. That was big, and I think that was like one of the things that we were really like hoping to push for. And I know we had worked with a couple of factories where the MOQ was going to be a bit higher, but like we were like, or at least that their starting point for the negotiation, it was going to be a bit higher. But we were going to be focused on like that was like our main one of our main drivers is like getting that MOQ down, that initial MOQ down, whether it was like trying to sweet talk them to saying that, hey, we're going to be back and it's in the best interest of both of us to have a good product. And so let's go ahead and get a test product out there, small MOQ, and then come back around, iron things out, and get a larger MOQ. And so like being able to start off with this salesman sample, this 200, 300 pairs, I think it's perfect. This is something that like I think keeps us afloat in the event that something like detrimental happens in the design process or the production process.
Yeah, and it's also just kind of the perfect number for a Kickstarter campaign. So a
Yeah.
Kickstarter campaign and then maybe a few additional weeks or whatever of selling. But it basically allows us to have enough inventory to cover that Kickstarter campaign, but not so much that if it flops, then we feel like we're never going to be able to sell through that inventory. So I think it's like you said, I think it's a huge deal. So I'm glad that 6 months later or whatever that we've been able to get that MOQ down by 10, a factor of 10.
Yeah. And I remember a conversation that we had, I think it was with Wes Felix, and he was like, get that MOQ down. Like that should be like one of your main focuses, like getting that down. It'll be helpful not only from like a if we need to iterate again perspective, but also helpful in like that whole supply demand type of a situation that consumers like will feel more compelled if there's a sold out, we're out of this, as opposed to like having plenty of every size. So
Yeah. Yeah, I was just talking about that conversation with Wes Felix a couple days ago, but I had
okay.
forgotten that he had made that point.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't think about that until right now, but I was like, oh yeah, Wes did
It
mention that too, that we need to go to bat and really fight for a lower MOQ.
makes sense. And then last question for me is, so Adam said, and a couple other people have said this too, just set a launch date and do everything in your power to make sure that that deadline doesn't slip. So what do you think about that? Do
I
you
mean, I
think that
think
would have worked for us?
that was ideal, right? Like we tried to do that before. We set a launch date, but there are certain things that were out of our hands. Like we could not make the factory do something that, you know, they weren't willing to do, or we couldn't like tweak the product, or we couldn't lower our standards and say this is good enough as well. I think there were certain things, and maybe that was like the one thing that we could potentially have overcome that was within our power. It's just like our own like ability to like just suck it up and say that, we're gonna like let this inferior product represent us in a Kickstarter. But we felt like we could do much better, and we knew that there's some changes that need to be made. So like I think that was a good decision. So I think ideally, yeah, set a date and then hold your feet to the fire by making it public, and then making sure that you do everything within your power to hit that date. That would be ideal, but sometimes it just does not happen like that. Um, and I wanted to do it. I've mentioned it in like other conversations, like let's just go ahead and put a date on it, and that will like force us to get it done. But I don't know if in most of the situations we aren't the holdup. Like we aren't the ones who are like causing it to be like pushed back. If we don't have a product, you can't you can't sell anything really. They're pre-orders and stuff, but you've got to be close enough to like a date to know like, oh yeah, we are for sure going to have product by that point. Otherwise, I think you do yourself more of a disservice than you do yourself like any kind of like benefit by like going public or initializing a launch when you're not ready or when the product's not ready.
Yeah, I remember about a year ago, we talked to this guy and he was basically like, you guys should just do a pre-order. Just do a pre-order right now and
Yeah.
you'll see if there's demand or not. And we were just kind of like, the product we have right now does not, it's only one shoe. It's like right, I can't remember if it's right or left, but it's only one shoe.
Right, a
Right
right
shoe.
shoe.
Yeah. It's a right shoe. So I mean, I guess we could show that, but it's also not what we're really envisioning that the final product will look like. And it could be like a year, it could be 18 months. So we don't want to really take people's money and then have them waiting for so long. And then their first interaction with our brand is very negative.
Yeah.
And that guy wasn't really buying, I think he's more of like a tech guy, but he wasn't really buying that argument at all. But it just reminds me of the set a deadline and hit it no matter what kind of argument. Like it's good to do that, but like you said, some things are just out of your control. And as much you could work 24/7, you could want it really, really bad, but if someone makes a mistake, they make a mistake. If someone is on vacation, they're on vacation. If you can't get in contact with someone, if they don't want to do something, you can't force them. So some of that stuff happens and it just slows you down. And I think for us, because we're new to this, and because we're such a small player, that we get deprioritized pretty easily. And that kind of stuff you can't, a lot of times you can't really control that.
Yeah, 100% agree. Adam kind of mentioned that, like, I mean, that's where his experience comes into play. Like, he had, a couple decades worth of like time in the industry prior to like his venture. So he's built up those relationships. He said he came in on the back of like another larger brand. So he was able to have the agents that like the agents who would be handling getting his product in country, like kind of go to bat for him. He already had like an established relationship with the factories that would be producing the shoes. I mean, it's just comparing like, his conversation to like our circumstances, it's kind of totally different in terms of like the variables. Um, and I get it, like I would definitely want to be able to set a date and do everything in my power to like hit that date. But there are certain things that, were just outside of our control, and we didn't have the same type of like established relationships or understanding or savvy of the industry that Adam, that his members of 1587 had. So I think it was a little bit different. Ideally, yes, I 100% agree with him. Like I think it's good to kind of set that goal and like kind of hold ourselves accountable to it. But yeah, we've based on our experience, we definitely did everything like within our power for the most part. I would say like we could have released an inferior product, but we did with everything within our power to like try to like hit those dates, hit those goals, and it just wasn't feasible, wasn't attainable.
Yep, 100% agree.
Well, I think that's everything that I've got. Um, no further questions. I don't know if we had any updates besides the potential and the possible or the probable slip of this initial launch to winter 2025 as opposed to fall 2024.
I mean, the only other thing I could think of is the potential retail partnership that you've been looking into.
Yeah, no, I think that's been cool, and that's something that we really wanted to do coming out of like conversations with bigger retailers like REI. We wanted to like have a more localized approach to a retail presence simply because of other founders that we've had conversations with, or we've been able to kind of note their own experiences with like big brands like Dick's or whatever, and they've been on the shelf, but they've kind of been like pushed to a side and really didn't get a chance to tell their story or to provide context that to help differentiate their product from what was already out there. And so we felt like talking to more local retailers would be key. We call them like mom and pop. And so I was able to like be connected with one. And I think here in Denver, and I think it's like really cool to like have that type of conversation where they like you wouldn't get the same level of engagement that you get with an REI, Dick's, Shields or whatever these big brand name retailers. You get this like one-on-one interaction with the owner, with the founder, and you get a chance to kind of like tell your value props when it comes to the shoe, like what you're wanting to do, getting their insight, their feedback, getting their understanding of like what their customers are looking for and how their customers interact, getting invited to like shadow their store. I think that's big and that's huge. And like these are the things that I think it was worth waiting for when we think about like setting launch dates. So that's still in the works, but something that I feel is very feasible for us right now is to have some sort of partnership with a local retailer.
Yeah, I think that would be huge. I was really excited. when you mentioned that, and definitely gotta visit that store when I get out to Denver and potentially meet that guy.
Yeah, very cool dude, Dan. Um, we'll we'll definitely be willing to share some insights with you. So when you get out here, yeah, we'll have to arrange a time to get out to the store.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Cool. Well, another good one. I don't think this one went too long, so
No, I think
hopefully,
like a little over an hour.
yeah. So that's good. But cool, man.
Till the next time, I guess.
Till the next time.